We're talking to John Bitzer, Baseball Trade Values. You can check out baseballtradevalues.com. Make sure you follow them. I think your Twitter handle is by the same name, Baseball Trade Values, right? At Baseball Trade Values. So the best I could describe this site, and I've tried a million times in certain pieces I've written in the past, is that it's a trade simulator. And they've had tremendous success, near perfect trade rate if you compare actual trades that are executed in Major League Baseball to what the site will spit out to you when you execute the trade in the site. And I feel like it's still kind of in the shadows. I feel like it should be more popular. I've seen it used on the Ringer a few times, and on some other sites. But sometimes I wonder, and give me your take on this if you've had any suspicions. Do you think baseball teams ever attempt to use this site to execute an actual trade?
So I've actually talked to baseball teams about this, so I can tell you firsthand. So I've seen some of them from their email addresses and and some of the technology can show you where people are coming from. I've seen them come into the site. One team in particular reached out to me about a month or two ago, and we've had a great discussion ever since. And they said they use it as a benchmark for the whole market as a whole, and in general they complimented us on being very accurate. And so in our latest discussion, I sort of half jokingly said, "Hey, you made 3 trades this year,
mm-hmm.
and they've all been very close to our values." And they laughed and said, "Yeah, in fact, after we made this one, we plugged it in, and it was off by like 0.1, and we thought, oh, that's funny." And the whole room was like, "Okay." So they use this as a benchmark, is what they were saying. But it's funny because I found that interesting because we're following them. They shouldn't be following us. We're just trying to mimic what's going on in their world. We're just using public data and putting some spreadsheets together and figuring it out ourselves. Just a couple of guys who are using public data, and they've got all sorts of internal data that I'm sure, is much more powerful than what ours is. So, we're never going to be perfect, but we're getting close. So I figured that's close enough to have a trading platform site.
So let's, that was a wonky question to start with. It was one that was on my mind, so I just threw it out there. Let's kind of get to the inception of this whole thing. What brought upon this idea, the concept of baseball trade values?
Well, I'm born and raised in California. I was an Oakland A's fan, and I saw Billy Beane making trade after trade, going back years. And I got, when you're an A's fan and you're always losing your players, you're thinking,
mm-hmm.
okay, let's get into the mindset of the team so I can sort of follow along, right? So that sort of got me into it. And I was writing for the Athletics Nation blog for quite a bit and really focusing on trade value. And after a while, I just started building spreadsheets and figuring it out. I have a background I have an MBA, and I've built financial models before. So I just sort of played around with statistics and tried to get a little bit more accurate. And over the years, I got it to where it was a little bit more accurate. And I sort of back tested, well, wait a second, if I go the other way and sort of said, looked at all the trades that happened, what do they have in common? And then that really helped as well. And a couple of years ago, I got laid off from my job. I was like, okay, what am I going to do? And I got a severance. I'm like, maybe I'll start a site. Let's just see what happens. So I did that, and I haven't promoted it. And you were saying earlier, you feel like it should be more well-known. People are just discovering it, and the word of mouth is spreading. So I haven't invested any marketing or whatever. I'm just letting it kind of fly, right? And it's growing and growing because people are talking about it more and more.
That's and I think I might have heard of it through potentially it was an article on the Ringer. I can't remember who read it, but maybe it was like a year ago or so. Yep. And I was writing for Call to the Pen, and I wanted to write a piece on a potential trade package. I can't remember who it was, and I checked your site out, and I was like, "This is insane." And then I started reading the about page and how you come about the calculations and everything, and how accurate it's been so far. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, how is it that not everybody in the world, and any baseball fan using this? So could you, for a layman such as myself, I was a teacher, a social studies teacher, so that tells you how good I am at math. How does it work? Like, did you code the site yourself? Do you have somebody code it for you? How did you determine the calculations? Like,
yeah. So the concept of surplus value has been around. I didn't invent it. I just know that it's been around, and it's generally an accepted term. But it's a very simple math equation. It's like what is the performance value of the player on the field minus their salary, and that gives you a surplus. So if he's worth 20 million on the field and he's only making 10, then he has a surplus of 10. So if you trade for that guy, you're trading for a guy who's worth 20. You're taking on his salary that's worth 10, but you got to give up some value to make up for that. You got to give up another sort of 10 million in value to get up for it. So it's a very simple equation. It's A minus B equals C. But the trickiness is, what is A? And it's trying to figure out the performance value. And that's where
exactly what I was going to ask you.
Yeah. And, there are projection systems out there like Zips and Steamer and Pacoda. And, we look at those, but a lot of times we have to kind of figure it out for ourselves because they don't update as frequently as we need them to. So we just sort of had to figure out what they're doing. There's a lot of sort of complex math involved, but you basically say, okay, this is are you familiar with the concept of war, which is wins above replacement? It's basically how much value does that person bring to a team? Like, is it an extra win? Is it extra 2 wins? Is it extra 3 wins? And there's typically a sort of a monetary sort of value if you study it over time, 8 or 9 million per win. And so you can kind of figure out if it's a 2-war player, it's worth 16 million. That's a very simplified thing. There are other things that sort of impact that, but without getting into too much complex math, that's basically what's going on. You get to sort of figure it out from there. But there's also sort of adjustments you have to make, like, what's the injury risk? A lot of people don't factor that. The aging curves. This guy's turning 34 versus a 24-year-old who's on the way up and hasn't peaked yet versus a 34 who's on the way down. And so when you're projecting out multiple years, you have to kind of look at the aging curve sort of studies and say, okay, there's probably going to go down and down from there. So you have to work all of that in, right? So that's where all the complexity is. The salary part's pretty easy. And so you just simple algebra from there. So it's fun. I just was doing it for fun, and now I'm realizing it's kind of becoming a business. So but the site is mostly for fun, because I realized most normal people are not going to do these calculations, right? And there wasn't a place for them to go. And so we figured out there was a gap in the marketplace. Like, what if we did it and put it out there? And a lot of people love just saying, hey, what if we could get this guy? I wonder what it would take. And people love to create trade proposals, right? So we're just making it easier for them. And so we built this simulator that has all these values in it and said, okay, go for it, have fun. And so that's the whole point of the site, is to have fun, and hopefully people can follow along with what their favorite teams, front offices are doing. And we're trying to get as close as possible to mimicking that.
So I heard you mention injury risk. How do you determine that, for example? Like, do you just look at players who are prone to injury, or?
Yeah, you know what? We're not doctors or insurance actuaries. It was just like, let's put a number up there and see what happens. And it's just playing around with trial and error until we got it sort of close enough and right to where it started working over time. I mean, obviously, the younger you are, the generally healthier you are, and the older you are, the riskier you are. But it was also sort of forced by early on when we saw like older guys. Like, I remember there was this guy, Ian Kinsler, a couple of years ago. He used to be in the Rangers. And at the end of his career, he signed a deal with the Padres for he was like a still decent, but ridiculously low number. I'm like, why is that number so low? Oh, it's because he's like 36, 37, and he's prone to injury, And so we sort of back tested it that way, right? We sort of started to see correlations. It's all about correlations, right? Just plug in a number until it works, basically. Now, the more injured you are, we have to factor that in. Like Jameson Taillon was just traded to the Pirates. He had 2 Tommy John surgeries. He had a cancer issue. We had to factor all of that in. Like, just put yourself in the shoes of the acquiring team. Like, how much risk are they willing to take on? Like, and just sort of estimate from there. That's the best we can do, to be honest. It's not perfect, but we get close enough with those estimates.
So are you a one-man team, or is there a group of people behind you working too?
I hired a guy named Joshua Iverson who hosts our podcast and helps me with a lot of the values, especially when, like in June, July, when we're coming up on the trade deadline, we sort of divvy up the work and we just crunch the numbers and update all the spreadsheets. So he's doing that. He's also helping write articles, and so he's my sort of sidekick. After that, I hired a tech agency to build the site and make enhancements to it here and there.
And then in terms of the site, so enhancements here and there from the whatever agency built your site, which, by the way, your site looks a lot like the Baseball Hall of Fame site. Is it the same agency? Would you happen to know?
I don't think it is.
Another random question. I have a lot of these.
Okay.
In terms of the coding that goes into this, did you design that yourself, or do you have
Yes.
somebody? Yeah.
Yeah, I basically said to the tech agency, okay, let's make sure that if it's within 10 or 20%, it's fair. If it's within, like I gave them the sort of parameters, and then they built that into the code in the simulator.
Have you ever considered venturing off into other sports, perhaps football, NBA?
Yes. Yes. Just wanted to get this one right first.
Okay. Yeah, of course.
But yeah, I mean, ESPN has a trade calculator, I think, for basketball. So we had to look at the market and say, well, I don't know, is that one working? Can we do a better job? Maybe. And then I'd probably have to hire somebody, because I'm not an expert in those other sports, the other three major ones. So I've looked into it, but I'm going to have to hire somebody who can, do as good a job. I know baseball really well, but I don't know those sports as well. I actually think hockey might be another one that's good, because they have a very intense fan base.
Yeah.
But I think the hard part will be to try to measure, like you do in baseball. There's a lot more statistics in baseball. Those other games are sort of fluid. Like, how can you calculate the value of a hockey player versus the other guys on the team? I'm not sure yet. We'll have to dig into that.
And with the NBA, it's almost, I don't want to say that it's simple. There's no way in hell that I could create a system like this. But with the NBA, there's also salary structures. Like, you can't trade a certain salary for a certain, so it has to match up all the time. So there's that component of it makes it, I would imagine, a little bit easier, just because there's some trades are just impossible. They just can't happen. You know what I mean? It kind of eliminates a big chunk of, possibilities.
Exactly. So you start to get into the business aspect of it, right? All the sort of, the salary caps and floors and revenue sharing and all this stuff. Is, when you go in, start looking at those other sports, especially football, because football is largely, the revenues are mostly coming from TV. And so like a small market team like the Green Bay Packers, if that were a baseball team, they'd be a low budget team, right? But they're on the same par as, all the other big, because they're all sort of sharing the same revenue, right? So it changes the whole picture. And then they've got these other rules as well. So, and also there's the dynamics are different, because most of the time what they're trading for is an established player for a draft pick, because the cycle of players is a lot, the turnover is greater, right? Players, it's a short shelf life, right? They come in as draft picks, they play for a couple of years, and they get hurt, and then they're done, right? So, with baseball, it's a longer timeline, so the arcs are different. So it's a whole other universe that we'd have to get into, but we're certainly looking into it.
Okay, cool. You've said you've spoken to some major league teams about using your system, and so on and so forth. Has there ever been a discussion about baseball potentially just sponsoring you and making you a certified MLB site? Is that a possibility down the line?
I haven't crossed that bridge yet. I don't know. I don't want to assume anything. I just want to do just trying to make it as good a product as it can be right now, and then we'll go from there. But I've certainly, as a sort of an entrepreneur, I'm sort of thinking about, could we license it to this outlet, or could we connect with those guys over there, or maybe there's a video game that could use this. I'm thinking about all those sorts of things, but it's still early on, so we'll see.
And I think that's why it's such an interesting site, because it comes from apparently it's coming off that you love baseball, you love the sport. This is a fun thing for you, and I feel like once it starts becoming a job, I mean, you've already built the foundation of it, but maybe it wouldn't have been this, the way it currently is, as it currently stands. Like you said, that the ESPN has a NBA one. I don't think people are using that probably as much as they use something like this, for example. Have you ever considered, after using this site, I talked to my co-host, and I was kind of hoping that he could jump in, but unfortunately he works for corporate America and he's in a meeting right now. So I told him, here's the link. If you can jump in. If not, don't worry about it. So after using this, I was like, we're big fantasy baseball players, and we're like, we should come up with a system for fantasy baseball trades. Have you ever thought of something like that?
I did think about that. But I've noticed that there is some competition there already. There are some other sites that are doing a fine job at that. So I didn't want to step on their toes and like, okay, that's covered. This area, which is more the real life aspect of it, if you will, is not covered. That's our niche, right? Because the rules in fantasy baseball are completely different. It's based on different scoring models and all sorts of other things. And so that would be a whole different system, right? And I figured, all right, people already have that covered. So probably not going to go there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some real world stuff. So most recently, the latest story in Major League Baseball is that the Rockies and the Cardinals are engaging in talks for Nolan Arenado. You're the baseball Nostradamus. That's what I'm calling you right now because of this. do you foresee something? I know you're not an insider, you don't have inside information or anything, but do you foresee a trade happening? If so, what kind of package do you see potentially going down?
So we have our estimate of Nolan Arenado's surplus value is negative 43. In other words, another way to think about this is, if you think about him as a potential free agent right now, if he were a free agent on the market and he's 30, you'd be paying for, let's say it's 6 years, similar to what Springer got. Springer got 150 million, right? Arenado is coming off his worst year ever, where he had injury issues, and you also have to factor in that he'd be outside of Colorado, where he has not been as good because he's been in the hitter's park. So you have to ask yourself, what would he get as a guy over 30, in his free agent years? And one way to think about that is to compare it to the market. And other sort of writers like Craig Edwards at Fangraphs said basically he would probably get 150 million. The problem is he's got a contract that's fixed for 199 million. So you can see there's about a 49 million difference. We're giving a little extra credit. So our numbers show that it would be, you give him a little credit for like being a superstar and marketable. So figure, okay, we've got it at minus 43. So that there is the first problem. Colorado would be selling low on him. They can't, one of the things we deal with sometimes is the perception of fans is, oh, he's a big star, he's an elite player, he's going to get a haul, but they don't look at the money aspect. And so when you think about that, okay, he's actually not going to get a haul. They have to either kick in a bunch of money just to break even, or take on another bad contract or two to kind of get it closer to even. And then on top of that, you want to get prospects back. So that's the hard part. I think the opt-out isn't so much of an issue, because I don't think Arenado, if he opted out after 2021, he would still be a 199 minus 30, 164 million. He's already guaranteed that, right? So at that point, he'd be 31. Why would he, he's not going to get a better deal than that, right? So I've never seen an athlete opt out of a contract that overpays them, right? Why would they do that? So he's not going to opt out. That, to me, is not the issue. And the issue is the team that's acquiring him would be taking on 6 years of a declining player at a very high price. So they're not going to be willing to give up much for him. If anything, they'd want to sort of work out the money. So that's the big obstacle in my mind. So the Cardinals, they've got a couple of underwater contracts with Carpenter and Fowler, but both of those guys have no trade contracts. So why would they agree to go to Colorado, which is probably looking at a few losing seasons ahead of them? So okay, that's probably not going to help, which means Colorado has to fork over some money if they just want to break even. And I don't know if they want to do that. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. I actually think it would be better if they didn't trade him now and just see what happens after the year. Either A, he returns to form and shows that he's healthy, and maybe he works his trade value, maybe let's say back to zero, because right now it's minus 43. And if at that point he thinks he can get a better contract, maybe he walks. And so then Colorado basically doesn't have to pony up any money. They're basically just saying, okay, it's a wash. Why not bet on that outcome instead of selling low at him right now, where they have to fork over a bunch of cash just to get rid of him? It just seems like a dumb time to trade him. But maybe they have ulterior reasons to do so. So, we could be totally wrong, but we crunch the numbers 6 ways to Sunday, and we keep coming up with, he's negative around that area, right? We may be off by 5 or 10 or whatever, but it's going to be somewhere in that neighborhood. We saw another data point when there were rumors of the Mets talking to them. The Mets said basically you have to take Cano. Cano is worth minus 40 in our model as well. So that sort of was a validation, like, okay, we're talking about roughly the same general sort of area here. So, but I don't know if the Cardinals can do that. The only way they can do that is if Colorado kicks in a bunch of money, and I don't know if they want to do that. So we're kind of stuck here.
I think also with Arenado, I think fantasy baseball plays a role in fans' eyes, because he's a shoo-in for 40 and 100 essentially every year. And that's a fantasy baseball gold mine. But as you said, in real life, he's playing a really tough position. He's only getting older, so his value is going to go down defensively, you would think, even though he's a Gold Glove, award winner every single year, Platinum Glove winner. You would imagine his bat will eventually start to slow down, especially if they trade him to another market. If I'm Colorado, I think I would stay with him too and see what I don't understand these teams that are so willing to part ways with their superstars so easily. And I get the market's slower, but why not give it a shot?
Yeah, well, Colorado has other bigger issues too, which is they've got other guys that are sort of, on there, like Trevor Story is in his last year before he can walk as a free agent. They really have not much on the farm coming up, so they really should be rebuilding. And I think they're starting to realize that. So, what they should be doing is trading Trevor Story. And if they really wanted to get a haul, their biggest trade chip is German Marquez, who's an excellent pitcher. And in our model, he's got $91 million in surplus value. So they would get a haul for him. They're not getting a haul for Arenado because of the money issues and so forth. One other point about Arenado, though, is he, his 2020 season, granted it was a short sample, but he basically wrecked his shoulder, right? And he was just diving to his left and what looked like to be a routine play, and it ruined his whole season. So if you're an acquiring team, you're like, okay, A, is the shoulder better? B, even if it is, how do we know it's not going to happen again? If you're just making a routine play, you're going to ruin a whole nother season. I mean, like, that's a lot of risk you're taking on. Money risk, injury risk, performance decline risk. I could go on.
How do you kind of put a value on the COVID season last year, the shortened season? Because he did have a down year, and I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but there's a number of players that had down years who have typically been pretty good, and I'm just like, I don't know how I can assign a value to that, because it was a shortened season. It was essentially a third of a season or a fourth of a season. How do you, for your system, how do you put a value on that? Like, did it change? Like, I don't know. You go ahead.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. We had to figure that in. So typically the most recent season, if it was a full normal season, would be worth about 60% of a value. You look at the last 3 years or so, and you have sort of a regression model, where the 60-30-10 is sort of an easy sort of way to think about it. Because it was a short season, you say, okay, well, it is important, but you have to sort of divide it by, it was 37% of a season. So it worked out to be not as significant as that. So, so it wasn't 60%, it was more like 40%, in other words, of a typical sort of weighting factor, if you will. So it's not like you completely throw it out, but it's not as meaningful as others. But we've seen enough activity to suggest that it was meaningful enough to teams. Now, the other sort of, a lot of people, like the Cubs players, for example, Bryant had a bad year, Javi Baez had a bad year. They're like, maybe it just, they didn't get on track. Okay, that's fair. But you can't sort of write it off either, because other players had breakout years and they're getting rewarded. So, it's fair, right? Either way. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, yes, but you can't ignore it either, I guess is my point.
Okay. So let's good transition into Kris Bryant. It's being said that he's potentially going to get traded. The Mets have been floated out there. What are the best matches for Kris Bryant right now? Which team's best match for him?
I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago that, anybody making like 20 million there or thereabouts or over is really hard to trade, because so many teams lost money in this pandemic year, right? And especially gate revenue, which is usually a correlation to their payroll. Only a few teams actually had money to spend, but even those teams are now sort of running up against their sort of limits. Like the Mets had money to spend because they had a new owner who didn't lose any money last year. So it's like, okay, bank's open. But then they actually made some very smart moves. They signed McCann instead of Realmuto. They signed some sort of, they figured they needed multiple positions, and they didn't splurge it all in one guy. But so they signed multiple guys, right? So now they're already sort of almost tapped out. Yankees are pretty much tapped out. You just saw them get rid of Ottavino last week because they were trying to clear some space. Toronto may still have a little bit more money, but they just signed Marcus Semien, so they don't really need it. Their infield looks to be full, so I don't see Bryant going there. So there's two things you need. You need a team that can afford his salary, and you need a team that needs a third baseman. You could argue that the Braves may be a destination that's a popular target on our site. I don't know if they can afford his $19 million salary either. You argue the Dodgers, they obviously need a third baseman, but they seem to be talking to Justin Turner. Most experts think he's just going to work it out, with them. And so, I don't know where Bryant's going to go. Problem number one is I don't know if there's a fit anywhere. Problem number two is which team can take on his salary. He's making $19.6 million this year. and there's not much surplus there. So the Cubs wouldn't be getting much of anything back because we have him as like a 2.7, 2.8 sort of in surplus. So that's basically just a minor prospect or two, is all you would get back. So like you have to then wonder, why would the Cubs even bother? Maybe they should just stick it out one more year. The NL Central is sort of up for grabs. Maybe they can get by, and and then you issue him a QO after the year is over and you get a draft pick. So it's about the same as you would get if you traded him. So why not just keep him?
Exactly. So and so you mentioned the Braves. The Braves were also, I think it was Dan Clark, reported that the Braves were in talks with the Indians for Jose Ramirez. And I think I would prefer Jose Ramirez. His contract is way more attractive. He's more versatile than Kris Bryant is.
Yep.
Do you foresee something like that happening?
No, it seems like a long shot. I mean, that was the only journalist I saw that floated that rumor, and none of the other ones did. And you can usually tell when there's smoke, there's fire. Like multiple journalists will be hearing it. Yeah. And so sometimes it's just an agent will find somebody to say, just to plant the seed to say, hey. And sometimes a journalist will pick that up and just to see what happens in the marketplace. And of course, fans pick up on it, and then the next thing you know, there's rumors. But other journalists are sort of, they know that game, right? And so sometimes they don't. I'm sure agents tell them a lot of things, and they don't report them because they know they're the agents just has an ulterior motive. So in other words, I'm not sure if that's a thing yet, and I'm not sure if there's any actual fire there. But you could argue that the Indians, having traded Lindor, maybe they're going to take a step back and rebuild. They do have a really strong farm, though, so I don't think they need to build up the farm for any reason. They've already cut budget quite a bit, so I don't know that they need to cut budget even further from here. Ramirez is beloved in Cleveland, so, and he's, like you said, he's got a team-friendly contract another 3 years, so there's no reason to trade him. So, and his value is already high. I think we have him at 72 something in surplus, so they would get a haul, but it's not like like I said, they need to. So and they've got Bieber, they've got a strong pitching staff. They're thinking maybe they can still kind of compete with the guys they have. They traded Lindor, but they got Jimenez and Rosario back, who should help fill that gap to some degree. So it's not like they're rebuilding, right? They typically don't. They just try to thread the needle. So I'm not sure there's a case for trading him.
What was the other question? Okay, so I was going to ask you about Lindor to the Mets, but I see that in your history page, you kind of broke that down already and saw how your system analyzed that trade, and it was, of course, predicted by your system to be accepted. So how about the Steve Matz to the Jays? Okay, here's what the question was. Steve Matz is a left-handed pitcher going into the Rogers Center with the Toronto Blue Jays in a division with the New York Yankees, who's right-handed heavy. This guy gives up a lot of home runs. Does your system take stuff like that into account when it's? I didn't see whether or not your system accepted this trade or not, but
it was fair.
It did. It was fair. Does it take stuff like that into account? The fact that he's a left-hander in a division where they're going to face a team 20 times or so that's super right-handed heavy, and if they're healthy, you have Giancarlo Stanton and Aaron Judge, and you know what I mean?
Yeah. A little bit, but not as much as you might think. With starters, they're typically going against balanced lineups that have lefties and righties, and so it's kind of a wash. The lefty thing is more important for relievers, actually, because they're much more situational, and those guys will be sought after just because the team needs them for those particular situations, right? We haven't found that much correlation with starters in handedness. And you're drilling down even to more a specific degree with, okay, how about handedness against a specific team that they're going to play a few times a year? Like that, we haven't drilled down that far, to be honest with you. And even if we did, it probably would be minuscule in terms of their overall sort of valuation. So it hasn't really been worth the effort. It's a good question, though, because I think you could make that case. But I don't think that's why the Blue Jays, wanted to trade for him. I think they just needed another starter and a depth arm, and they've been compiling a couple of guys who are turnaround projects. So they must think they can fix them. I think they've got some ideas there about how to kind of fix their pitch mix. Robbie Ray is another guy who struggled last year. And they picked up him again. They re-signed him. Ross Stripling has had some troubles, but they're carrying him. So they basically have a plan to turn around these guys. We'll see if it works. And I think it'll be very interesting. Actually, Josh, my colleague, just wrote an article today about that. He thinks it will because he's dug into the numbers and sort of figured out what they might be seeing in these guys. So we'll see if it works.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I was during the winter meetings this year. It was digital, unfortunately.
Hmm.
But I attended the Charlie Montoyo Zoom call, and he spoke glowingly of Robbie Ray. He loves this guy, and to be honest with you, I do too. I think his problem is he has very little command. He walks
Yeah.
way too many people, but if he
Yeah.
can get that under control, this guy could be a top 10, 15 pitcher in baseball. Because I mean, his stuff is filthy.
Yeah. He changed his arm angle this
Yeah.
past year. His intention was to try to cut down on the walks. He was thinking, okay, I'm going to improve my command, but it kind of backfired on him because
Yeah.
then they just started, he's throwing gave up a bunch of homers. He was already
Yeah.
homer prone. It became even more so. He was basically
Right.
just throwing flat fastballs. So it's like, okay, maybe that's not the answer either. So we'll see if Toronto has a plan to fix him. He's a fix-it project right now.
For sure. All right. So the Yankees, you probably guessed by this point, I'm a Yankees fan. So the Yankees engaged in what I'm calling a salary dump when they got rid of
Mm-hmm.
Adam Ottavino. And in
Mm-hmm.
exchange, they got back Darren O'Day, which is a pretty good. I mean, it wasn't a trade, but they traded away for cash essentially with the money. They got Darren O'Day, an older pitcher, but a more effective pitcher for sure. And it looks like they might have a little bit more money to play with. Do you think, in terms of your system, where does your system? What are some? I'm assuming they're going to try to get a left-handed bat, and Brett Gardner's still out there. Maybe they'll bring him back, but where does your system value Brett Gardner at? That's one. And if it's not Brett Gardner who they bring in, what are some other left-handed bats that they could potentially go after?
Yeah, we're seeing left-handed bats kind of fly off the market.
Yeah.
Schwarber was signed by the Nationals a while ago, and Jock Peterson was just signed by the
Yep.
Cubs. Who, by the way, side note on the Cubs, they suddenly they've been given a little bit more budget now to work with. Whereas everyone thought there was a fire sale going on there, and now they're like, well, maybe not. Anyway, that's so. But the left-handed bats are coming off. Eddie Rosario is still out there, and he's apparently drawing some interest. I can't quote you a figure on Gardner's number, but look, he's what, 37?
37, 38, yeah.
So given aging curves and so on, he's not going to be expensive. He's probably going to be 5 million-ish thereabouts. So they've got some wiggle room in their. I think they're trying to stay under the salary luxury tax limit, which is why they got rid of Ottavino and replaced him with a cheaper reliever. And now they're thinking maybe we can squeeze one more guy in. So maybe it's probably Gardner, and they're probably working it out with him. It's somewhere in that range, 5 or 6 million range. I'm guessing, so that they can stay in under the cap. They also need to save a little wiggle room, because in July, sometimes when you're contending, you need to pick up another guy in trade, and that means you need to take on that contract. So they've got to leave a little room for that as well. Right. But I think that's what they're trying to do.
I wonder, a team like the Yankees, why they're so married. I understand in years past, but with the CBA coming up at the end of this year, that number is kind of who knows what it's going to be next year. We have no clue. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it could change entirely. So I don't know why they're so married to staying under it. I get, again, in most years I get it. I'm not the kind of Yankees fan that thinks that they should go and get every player under the sun, but this year in particular, I'm like, are you so close? Like, why are you, I don't know.
I think it's because, with the pandemic and the gate revenue going down and everything, it was like, okay, this is the year to stay under the tax, because it's not the year to splurge, right? Because we're not going to get that much in revenue. And the Yankees, saying
also, who knows how many games they're going to play this year, or things are still up in the air. So.
And keep in mind, the penalties are not just financial; they lose draft picks too, and sometimes international space as well. So that's all sort of feeding the system from the bottom up as well. So they don't want to do that. And the Yankees are very smart about feeding their system, really good around the international prospect side. And so they just traded 4 guys for Tyone, and they barely even made a dent in their farm, because they were all sort of in this general sort of youngish 45 million-ish range in our system. So they're good at replenishing that way. So they don't want to lose that. In other words, by going over the cap, that would be a risk.
All right, and then final thing is about minor leaguers. How do you implement this system to assess minor leaguers? Because we don't know how injury prone they are, or all of these numbers that you use to evaluate big leaguers who've been there for a while. How do you do that for a player just coming up? How do you assess the value for them?
So we're indebted to some research that was done by, there was an old site a few years ago called The Point of Pittsburgh that was very, Pirates fans dug in and studied, okay, let's look at all the Baseball America prospects from years and years and years and how they did and what their value was and how much WAR they produced overall. And they, and then Fangraphs picked that up. They bought that research from them and said, okay, let's update it. And so Craig Edwards, Fangraphs, did a whole piece about 2 years ago saying, here's what, generally speaking, a 50 graded prospect is worth, and a 45 and a 40 in the aggregate. So we use that as sort of once that was like an aha moment when I said, okay, that's what we're going to use. It's very established research to kind of plug in our numbers. Now, and so what we do is we follow the public evaluators. Baseball America being the most prominent one, but also Fangraphs and a few others. And we sort of work out a weighted model that says, okay, he's a 50 here, he's a 45 there, and that has a number value associated. And that's how we get our numbers. And we're generally in the ballpark. There is higher variance with prospects, though. As we know, prospects will bust, they will become superstars, they'll become regulars. There's all kinds of outcomes, right? But one of the things that research showed is the higher, generally speaking, the higher rated they are, the more likely they are to make it to the bigs, and the more likely they are to become stars. And it's kind of it's a long tail distribution model. It's weighted very heavily at the top end, right? So the top 10 prospects, generally speaking, you can almost count on very high probability that they're going to make it and be highly productive. And then 10 through 30, probably still a little bit less so, but still high probability, and just go down there from there. Once you get to the sort of middle and bottom, that's where the higher probability, the risk is. Like those guys are probably long shots, right? And then you especially get to the bottom, those are even more long shots. Those are guys who are either not as toolsy, there's got some red flags, or in some cases they're younger guys who are just sort of speculative, right? They may be the latest 16-year-old you just signed, and you don't know what you got, and so they're at the bottom. And as they perform, they'll start to prove themselves a little bit more and show that they can actually prove against competition. So their value will go up from there, and it will jump a little bit. So one of the things that we see in our model is, this guy jumped, year after year, like he was a 45 and now he's a 50, and that's a big jump in terms of value because he sort of established himself. So that means his probability of making it is that much higher. So it's a little bit more speculative. And we're just sort of saying, in the aggregate, are we still right? And we generally find that we are, but there will be individual cases where, that one was a little bit off. So because that, a lot of times we don't know that there's been an upgrade until we find out 2 months later. That happened with Simeon Woods Richardson of Toronto when the Mets traded him for Stroman. He was a 45, and then 2 months later, no, he's on the BA top 100. Okay, you should have told us that then, So, and then that worked out. So the latest trade with Pittsburgh and San Diego, when they traded Musgrove, the key guy coming back there was Hudson Head. We were off on that one, but I will knock on wood and bet you that Hudson Head's going to be the top 100. And we're about to find out that he's a lot higher rated than when we first thought, because we're dealing with old data. So that happens too. So, but in the aggregate, it seems like we're in the ballpark. It's just individual cases will vary.
I lied. I have at least one more question. What is the most lopsided trade that you were just you were like, I can't, your system didn't accept, and it was just like, what? Could you think of one off the top of your head?
AJ Preller of San Diego made one last year when he traded for Austin Nola, and he gave up Taylor Trammell, who was a top 100 prospect, and a few other guys. And Austin Nola was a 30-year-old journeyman catcher. We're like, what the, typically your 30-year-old journeyman catcher is not worth that much, right? I mean, Seattle had signed him off the street, basically. So how is it all of a sudden that San Diego's given up all of this value for him? That one was a head scratcher. And so then I told you earlier that, I've been in contact with one of the major league teams, and I actually talked to them about that one. And he said, you know what, the trend is lately to kind of jump the gun, to anticipate, because everybody knows everything, right? You can't outsmart another team because we're all using the same system. All the teams are using kind of the same valuation models. So the only way you can kind of get, and keep in mind, Preller of San Diego was trying to get productive guys that weren't making a whole lot in salary. So he sort of figured, okay, Austin Nola had a small sample the year before and was hot again in 2020. So he's basically going to jump the gun and bet that he's going to continue that level of productivity. And it was a gamble, but he was willing to make it because he didn't have the budget to pay a high price for a aging catcher. And he had plenty of prospect capital to deal with. So he's like, okay, I'm just going to overpay for this guy and jump the gun. And so that's going to happen once in a while, but he seems particularly prone to doing that. So we actually crunched the numbers like with Preller and without Preller, because he's the only GM that seems to want to like go outside the grade.
Yeah.
All the other ones pretty much are, stay inside, but he's got his own motivations. So he's become kind of a running joke between Josh and I'm like, oh, it's Preller again. What's he going to do? So that
look at all the players he's acquired too. It's insane. I mean, San Diego Padres are, in my mind, it's 1 and 2 between the Mets, not the Mets, the Dodgers and San Diego this year coming out of the National League. Unless if the Mets go ahead and pull off a deal with Trevor Bauer, then I don't know how you beat that rotation. But
yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, and I give him all the credit in the world, because he's taking a lot of gambles, but he also had, keep in mind, he had one of the best farm systems in baseball to deal from. And there's you can't fit all those guys in your roster, right? So it's like burning money in your pocket. You might as well spend it, right? To get some, if your goal is to build up your major league team, go ahead and spend that prospect capital. All the other teams knew it. So all the other teams was like, okay, let's make a deal. And so you saw them, I mean, I don't know how many prospects they traded, but it was a boatload. And they still managed to keep their top guys. They still managed to keep Mackenzie Gore, CJ Abrams,
Coutinho. Well, he's gone now.
They sent in the Snell trade. But yeah, and they've still got a couple others that are coming, like Weathers and Hassel. So, he's basically dealt from the middle to the bottom of his farm. He's like said, okay, that's all open season. I'm just going to keep my top 4 or 5 guys. The rest of them are open season. And he did it. So good for him.
I know I said I had that was the last question like 2 questions ago.
Sure.
I had to have 2 more now. I'm sorry.
Sure.
The last question that I'm going to save is what's next, but let's save that because I do have one more. So again, I am a Yankees fan, and the Yankees have been accused of prospect hoarding for a while. And I kind of agree. I feel like if you have these players and you have a need on your team and you could trade those players to fit that need to potentially win a World Series, you should probably make that trade. But they haven't, it seems like. Is that accurate? Have they been prospect hoarding, or have they been justified in holding on to these guys? What do you think?
I think it's a little of both. Because I looked at their system, and they've got, 2 things. They don't have the best farm system. They've got Jason Dominguez and David Garcia, Clark Schmidt, but these guys are like in the 30s and 20s in our model, right? They're not like Wander Franco, who's over 100. Right. There's not like the Rays system, right? So part of it is, it's like, if you think about it from an investment standpoint, it's most likely that these guys are going to appreciate in value as they grow up through the ranks. So it's like he may be worth 30 now, but he could be worth 60 in a year or 2, right? So like, if you're an investor, you don't necessarily want to give that up, right? Because that's capital you can use later. So they look at it from that point of view. But they've also got a whole bunch of, they've spread their bets around quite a bit. There's got a whole bunch of guys, like I said, in between 4 and 10 in value, that some will make it, some won't, some will break out, some will fall off, and they've seen some of that happening, some of that attrition happening. Albert Abreu, for example, was higher rated a couple of years ago, and now
Esteban Florial.
Esteban Florial was higher. He got a lot of hype, and he hasn't really, done much, and so his stock has dropped. So that's going to happen. So you run the risk of that happening, right? If you didn't make a deal for Florial 2 years ago, you've kind of lost some of that value. Yeah. So, but then it's kind of a crapshoot. And Cashman himself has said it's a casino basically, and it's all a game of probabilities, right? So you want to maximize your probabilities, and that's I don't want to get into all the sort of other things that go into it, like player development. They can kind of work out kind of who's got more potential than others. But then the other teams know this as well. So there's a lot of gamesmanship going on. Like, oh, that guy's got some helium. Like, oh, he's probably going to go up, so we're not going to trade him. Well, then why would I want to trade the other guy who doesn't? So there's a lot of sort of picking and choosing. And as I was saying earlier, the team saying you want to jump the gun. Sometimes you want to jump the gun for a guy who's got helium, who may be low rated now, but they've got the potential to appreciate in value later. That's what I think was going on with Hudson Head, Padres to the Pirates. So anyway, I'm rambling, but the Yankees farm, point number 1, is not as deep as you think it is, because it's got a lot of sort of low level prospects that are sort of lottery tickets. And so they're waiting for them to appreciate and see what they really have. And the second thing is, I think everybody's kind of prospect hoarding right now because of the economic situation. They don't want to overpay in retail prices, so they're trying to get production out of sort of cheaper younger guys, right? And so everybody's kind of holding on because they realize those guys are very valuable. You get them for 6 years, assuming they make it. And they're making league minimum at the beginning, so you get the next Fernando Tatis and your gold, right? You get the next Juan Soto and your gold. So everybody wants to hold on, thinking they've got the next Juan Soto, right? So you don't want to trade that away,
right? Or when you see the Rays, with a $60 million payroll, make it to the World Series, and you're the Yankees with a $200+ million payroll, and you're getting dumped by the Rays in the division series. I don't know how Steinbrenner doesn't say like, what pull his hair out. I understand it's a crapshoot, but that team, that Rays team, I don't know how they do it.
They've mastered the art of it, right? And so they're always anticipating. They're always a step ahead of everybody, right? And they will make bold trades. Like they'll trade a top prospect for a reliever, like they did with Nick Anderson. Like what the heck? When they realize, but it worked for them. So Billy Beane a couple of years ago in an interview said, it's like basically I'm managing Menudo. You remember the boy band Menudo?
Yeah.
So the idea there was they were always like 16, right? And as they get older, they would replace them with younger guys, right? It's basically what the Rays are doing, and other teams are sort of noticing that because they've got sort of a cycle going on. Once they get to like 3 or 4 years in and they get expensive, they trade them away, like they just did with Blake Snell for Luis Patino and some other guys, and they just keep the cycle flowing that way.
Right. It's impressive. All right, John, I've kept you long enough. I think I did 4 questions after I said final question.
Sure.
I could keep talking forever, but maybe you can come on sometime in the future to talk a little more. But this was fun, guys. John Bitzer here from Baseball Trade Values. You can follow him at Baseball Trade Values on Twitter. Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it, Manuel. It's been fun.
All right, thank you. See you.
Mm-hmm.